Hello, welcome back. Hope you're all doing well. We are back to normal transmission now after our month of spooky Halloween content. I'm hoping that means that my equipment starts reliably working again now that there isn't any witchy spirits hanging around causing mischief. That's not to say, however, that I don't have plenty more wrong-uns lined up as we dive into more true crime cases together. So today's case is an interesting one. It's pretty jarring in its details, and the person responsible for these crimes truly shocked the nation and even the police when they were eventually identified. So today's case begins in the early hours of Saturday morning on the 29th of March 2014, where a man is found fighting for his life after having been brutally attacked in Castle Park, Colchester, a town in the county of Essex in the southeast of England. A passerby finds this man and immediately calls the emergency services, who arrive at around 5:45 a.m. The paramedics fight to save the life of this very badly injured man, but to no avail, when at 6:31 a.m. he is pronounced dead. The name of this man was 33-year-old James Fairweather. James, or Jim as his family knew him, was described as a very pleasant man. He was fun-loving and enjoyed spending time with his family, joining in with fun activities, his favourite being karaoke. James was a father of 5 and a shy, decent person who had already been through so much in his 33 years. In 2010, just 4 years before this attack, James had been involved in a road traffic accident in which he received horrific head injuries. The injuries James suffered left him in a coma for 8 weeks. He emerged from the coma with brain damage and had lost some of his motor functions. James wasn't even in a car at the time of this accident. He was just a pedestrian who was walking home when a car hit him and left him with life-changing injuries. And so in 2014, James was just starting to come out the other side of that accident. He was finally starting to see some results from his recovery. He was adapting to this new way of life and learning to live with what had happened to him. He was also starting to get his memory back, which he'd lost after the accident. So that was something that James and his family were feeling really good about. James was finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel until March 2014 rolled around. The 28th of March 2014 was a Friday night, and James was meant to meet up with his sister Jo, but for whatever reason he cancels and decides to go for a drink alone at the River Lodge pub in Colchester. Jo, upset that he's cancelled, texts him to tell him off a bit in the same way you might do with a sibling. But as it happens, that would be the last time that Jo would communicate with James, and those would be the last words she ever said to him, and it's incredibly painful for her that she can never take those words back. As the night continues, James, still alone in the pub, ends up having quite a few drinks to the point where he becomes pretty intoxicated. Eventually, he leaves the pub and decides to walk home. He takes a shortcut to his house by walking through Castle Park, but he stops halfway to smoke a cigarette, and it's at this point that he starts to feel tired. On this evening, he's had quite a bit to drink, so he ends up laying down on the grass in Castle Park and falls asleep. Just before 1 a.m, a man himself walking home from an evening out cuts through the park and spots James lying on the floor. He asks him if he's okay, and James says that he is. And the man warns him. He says, "You want to be careful, mate." And sadly, those words would come to have a much more tragic meaning, because between the times of 1 a.m. and 5:30 a.m, James is brutally attacked by an unknown assailant. James is stabbed up to 102 times by this assailant, so by the time the paramedics get there, he's still alive, but he's been laid there for hours suffering. Sadly, they can't save him, and James Fairweather passes away at the scene. After he passes away, James is taken away and examined by pathologists. As we know, James is found to have 102 stab wounds, but there are some wounds that are different to others. They're close to the surface, as though the perpetrator was making small incisions as well as large ones on purpose. There's wounds all over James' torso, his face, and one eye. It's also found that James had likely put up a fight for his life, because there were cuts all down his hands and arms where he'd attempted to defend himself from his attacker. Now it's time for police to inform James's family about this horrific attack, and as soon as officers tell Julie, James's mother, that he's passed away, she immediately thinks that he's hurt himself by a trip or a fall. He'd struggled with his mobility since the accident, and Julie assumes that he's gotten into difficulty that way. He's fallen and he's hurt his head. But when she's told what actually happened, she's in total shock. She knows James had no enemies, he certainly would never start any conflict, so she immediately comes to the conclusion that it had to have been a random attack. Now, of course, this seemingly random and vicious attack really shakes the people of Colchester. It's a brutal attack on a decent and vulnerable member of the public in what was thought to be a safe location. And the forensics really do little to help the police figure this case out. They find very little forensic evidence from James's body or from the crime scene, and there's very few CCTV cameras in that particular area, so that's of no help either. In a bid to get some sort of assistance, Essex Police put out an appeal to the public, describing this murder as a frenzied attack, and they appeal to anyone who has any information to come forward. Seeing these appeals and then no arrests being made, the people of Colchester get more and more nervous. They know there's a killer on the loose who could strike at any moment. So they avoid walking home at night. Vulnerable people in the community are given attack alarms by police, and the police themselves increase patrols, bringing extra officers in from further afield in a bid to protect the public. But even though there's a lot of police covering the area and many forensic searches, they don't find much at all that can help them in this manhunt. Knowing he had no enemies, James's family are confident that this was a random attack, so it seems inevitable to them that this person will strike again. And they do. On the 17th of June 2014, 3 months after James was killed, a man is out with his friend searching for his missing cat on the Salary Brook Nature Trail in Colchester, a route popular with dog walkers and one that students frequently walk along to get to the nearby Essex University. It's during this walk that the two men discover a body. This body has again been the victim of a brutal attack, with stab wounds to both the head and body and both eyes. What is particularly jarring here is that this body is found at around 11 a.m, and it's thought that the attack itself took place at around 10:30 a.m, so this attack has taken place in broad daylight. The police arrive on the scene quickly after, and the body is taken away for examination and identification. As I said, this body has stab wounds to the torso and to the face, but not as many wounds as James has received. But there is one main similarity between both attacks. This body too has those superficial, smaller stab wounds. And this body is identified as Nahid al-Manaya. Nahid was a Saudi Arabian woman who was 31 years old. She was a student at the University of Essex and a very intelligent lady. Nahid was studying for a PhD in life sciences, and to enhance her future career prospects within the scientific profession, she decided to also study English, which is why she'd chosen to come over to the UK. And Nahid was doing incredibly well. Even though she'd only been in the UK a short time, she was already excelling in her studies. Nahid lived with her brother, who also studied at the university, and usually the pair would walk to classes together. But on this day, her brother had to leave early, which meant that Nahid had to walk to class alone. She was described by her family as warm and loving. She loved to laugh and was very close to her family. Her classmates described her as friendly and inspiring in the way that she approached her studies. Nahid was a Muslim, and she would wear traditional Islamic clothing, that being an abaya and a hijab, and on the day of her death that's what she was wearing, plus a pair of sunglasses. And there's a reason I'm telling you that, which I'll touch on later. It's thought that it was around 10:30 a.m. on the 17th of June 2014 that Nahid was walking from her accommodation on Woodrow Way along the Salary Brook Nature Trail, going towards the Wivenhoe campus of Essex University to attend class, and that's when she encountered her attacker. Nahid was barely 5 foot tall, so if her attacker was male and of average height or more, it's likely he had a decent height advantage over her, which would have made fending off her attacker very difficult. Of course, on hearing the news, her family are devastated and issue a plea to Naheed's attacker to come forward. It's an incredibly traumatic event for all of the family, and they experience even more trauma when the media release a photo which they assume to be Naheed, but is actually someone else entirely. The family express that this was even more stressful for them to witness a stranger's face in the media with their relative's name next to it. I don't actually know what Naheed looked like. There is 1 or 2 photographs online that could be her, but without confirmation I won't be posting any photos of Naheed in this video. Now, of course, the 2 killings within the space of 3 months really scares the community of Colchester. The 2 victims couldn't have been more different, so people don't know what to think. Is this 2 separate attacks, or is it one attacker who seemingly has no pattern to their killings, and so everyone and anyone could be a target? This attacker has struck at totally different times of day too, one at night and the other one during the day. So even that doesn't narrow down this person's next move, and that unpredictability causes anxiety in the community. The killer has absolutely no pattern or clear motivation for their actions, which makes them so much more difficult for police to predict their next move. Of course, theories about the killings are widely circulated on social media. Some are convinced that there's a potential serial killer on the loose. Others believe that there's 2 attackers and that Naheed's death had been motivated by reasons of race or religion or both, hence the reason I told you what she was wearing on the day of her attack. The heavy police presence after James's killing continues once Naheed is found, and even further measures are taken to try to keep the residents of Colchester as safe as possible. 3 rivers are drained in an attempt to find evidence, but to no avail. The nature trails, green spaces and parks in the area are all heavily cut back, so that if a killer is lurking, they won't have any bushes to hide in. It gets to the point where people stop going to parks and nature trails. People are too afraid to go in case they're attacked, and the many students who walk through the Salary Brook Trail where Naheed was found now find alternative routes to get to and from university. One thing that I heard whilst researching this case, which I found fascinating, is what's called the just world belief that the public can take on at times like this. After the first murder, whilst people are worried, they start to think, well, this won't happen to me. This man was drunk, he was out in the middle of the night, he was in a vulnerable state. I won't put myself in that position, and so it won't happen to me. But then there's a second murder, and this happened in broad daylight to someone who was just out walking. And that just world belief is now shattered because Naheed wasn't drunk or out late at night. She could so easily have been anyone, and that's when the fear gets stronger amongst the public in the local area. I just thought that was fascinating, and I didn't realise that there was an actual name to put to that sort of behaviour that the public take on during times like this. The police continue to make appeals via television and social media, but they continue to make little progress. The forensic evidence is so limited and the victims so seemingly random, the police just keep hitting dead ends. An appeal goes out on BBC's Crime Watch in an attempt to get people to come forward. Police give out handouts mentioning a white man in a red hooded top who could be a person of interest to them. There's also a picture of a tan jacket released that looked similar to the one that a man was wearing in the Salary Brook Trail on the day of Naheed's killing. And still, even after all that, the police are no further forward in apprehending their killer. This is turning out to be one of the largest murder hunts in the history of Essex Police, and the cost of the investigation comes to around £2.6 million. And even though 70 people who have previous convictions relating to knife crime are brought in and questioned, the police have no luck in bringing anyone to justice, and will have no luck for almost a year. It wouldn't be until May 2015 that this case would blow wide open. On Tuesday, 26th of May 2015, a local lady named Michelle Sadler is out walking her dog, very close to where Naheed was murdered almost a year prior. Michelle spots a young man stood on a small footbridge, and he's just standing there, hanging around. Now, instincts are incredible and they're always worth trusting, in my opinion, and Michelle trusted her instincts here. She knew about the attacks from a year before, and she knew that one of them had taken place very close to where she's standing. It's also 10:30, the same time that the attack had happened a year before, and this young man makes her feel uncomfortable just by his presence. She's looking at him and he's looking right back at her, and she feels panicked, so she decides to turn direction and walk away from him as quickly as possible. As she's walking away, she spots an acquaintance of hers, and the two begin to talk. She mentions this intimidating looking character, and the pair decide to walk back to see if he's still there. And he is, but now he's stood under a tree, just looking around as if he's waiting for something. Michelle then realises he's also wearing a tan jacket that the police had mentioned in their appeals, and she calls the police. The police arrive just 10 minutes later, and this young man is still there. As they approach him, the closer they get, they realise he's wearing latex gloves. They ask him what he's up to which he replies that he's out for a walk to clear his head because he doesn't feel quite right. The officer asks him if he has something on him that he shouldn't, and he says yes, he has a knife in his pocket. It's at this point he allows the officer to take the knife from him, and the young man is arrested for possession of an offensive weapon. Safe to say, Michelle, trusting her instincts, could well have saved her life, and who knows how many more lives. But as it turns out, the man who's been taken into custody is barely old enough to be considered a man at all. It turns out he's a 15-year-old schoolboy named James Fairweather. James Fairweather was born 5th of August 1998. He grew up in a stable, comfortable home with his parents James and Anita and his sister Gemma. He lived just down the road from his school, Colchester Academy, and there was really nothing out of the ordinary about his upbringing. As a little boy in primary school, he was described as a sweet boy, sensitive to the feelings of others. He enjoyed playing darts with his dad at the local darts club, and his fellow clubmates said that he was a quiet boy, like a dormouse. He was very respectful to them and his dad. It was only when he started secondary school at the age of 11 that things started to change within James, and his character took on a very dark turn. He was frequently bullied at school about his outward appearance. Kids said his ears stuck out and they would call him Dumbo in the usual way that kids can be so horribly cruel. James also didn't have any close friends. He was a loner. He also struggled with his studies and as a result was in the lower sets for most of his school subjects. James had dyslexia too, which was also a challenge for him. And so between his frustrations with finding his schoolwork difficult, being bullied and a loner, this really impacted James, and it was made so much worse when in 2012 James's grandmother died. James adored his grandmother. She meant the world to him, so when she passed away he was grief-stricken. The bullying for James continues, and at one point a group of boys gather around him and threaten him with a knife. He manages to escape after they've mugged him, but it wouldn't be long before knives would feature heavily in James' own life, quite possibly as a result of this experience. The way that James responded to the challenges in his life was to become a very withdrawn, insular and angry young man. When James attended school, he was unruly and violent to his teachers in a bid to impress his fellow classmates. He would hit other kids, lash out at teachers and throw school furniture around. After receiving a less than complimentary school report, he ripped it up in front of everyone and walked out, causing his teacher to refer to him as a thug. And by the time James was 14, he was already breaking the law and had received a youth referral order. His conviction was for robbery when, on the 20th of January 2014, James robbed his local newsagent at knife point on the Greenstead estate where he lived. He stole £30 in cash, some cigars and a lighter. Shortly after the robbery, he went back into school and told his classmates what he'd done, showing them the cash he'd taken. It seems James got a kick out of what he'd done and enjoyed the power he'd felt from that experience. James didn't even smoke, but he told classmates he did this as a warm-up, like a practice run. James was arrested as a result of his bragging. That's how the police found him, and that got him a 12-month youth referral order. Youth referral orders, I believe, are an alternative to a prison sentence. They're a little like community service for under 18s. The offender must sign a contract where they agree to repair the damage they've done in some way or another. And this agreement keeps them from getting a harsher sentence so long as they carry out the work. And that's what James did. Much later, an Essex County Council spokesperson would confirm that during his referral order, James was in contact with the youth offending team at least once a week, and he did comply with everything that was required of him. But the order did nothing to rein James in. Even when he was in his final year at school, he was still trying to impress classmates, telling teachers that his chosen career was to be a murderer. He told anyone who'd listen that he was going to bring a knife into school on his last day and use it on his classmates and head teacher. When he wasn't at school, James would sit at home alone while his parents were spending long hours at work, and he would play violent computer games and watch very explicit and violent films. Now, whilst I don't personally believe that violent video games and films can cause children to be violent, I do think that if a child is predisposed to violent behaviour, then consuming this kind of content could certainly exacerbate that. And as we know, James has already showed violent behaviour in the past, so these video games and films couldn't have helped him. James would spend a lot of time fantasising about hurting men and women in the many horrific ways there are to do so. James was also obsessed with serial killers, owning a significant stash of media and books all related to serial killers. He was spending all of his time researching killers and finding out about the finer details of their crimes. He was seeing them as his heroes, people for him to look up to and emulate someday. And this brings us up to the point in the timeline where James has been taken to the police station so they can question him as to why he's carrying a dangerous weapon. And when they sit down to question him, the response from James is shocking, to say the least. He very nonchalantly sits there and, out of the blue, admits to killing James Atfield and Naheed Al-Manea. He admits to these killings with virtually no encouragement, like he's been waiting to be able to tell his story. He tells police how the night of James' death he'd waited until his parents were asleep and then sneaked out of his home through the living room window, choosing that option so his parents wouldn't hear him open the front door. Once outside, he starts roaming his estate looking for someone to kill, but he can't find anyone, so he starts to walk a little further afield, over to Castle Park. This is where he finds James Atfield drunk and sleeping in the park after a night out.
I saw him. It was laying on the grass. Like that. It was like just fast asleep, where he was drunk. Can I stand up?
Yes.
Went up to him. Stood over like that. No. I stabbed him first there. I've done it a few times.
James is saying the most terrible things, but the way he's describing it to police is almost like he's reading off a shopping list. He sounds as if he has absolutely no comprehension of the seriousness of what he's done. The police are astounded that this 15-year-old boy is very calmly confessing to these killings in minute detail. He's even standing up and giving demonstrations of what he did without a sign of remorse. After the attack on James Atfield, James Fairweather tells police how he returned home at around 2:30 a.m. He undressed and put his blood-stained clothing in a bin bag. He then left the bag in a dog bin nearby, which was later taken away with the usual rubbish collection. Then he took the knife and washed it, and the next day threw it in the nearby River Colne. He used this same method of disposing of evidence for both murders. For the killing of Naheed, James left his house armed with a bayonet, and he made his way to the Salary Brook Trail. There he hid in the bushes, waiting for someone to pass. As Naheed passed him, he chose her at random and jumped out from the bushes and attacked her from behind. I don't want to get too graphic here, so I'll just say that he attacked her from behind, then pushed her sunglasses off her face in order to attack her face too. Police are able to get details from James that hadn't been made available to the public, so they're starting to become very confident that they have their man, or child in this case. The police then proceed to search James's bedroom, and they find all of this material about serial killers in the form of DVDs, online articles and books. Now, I must take a moment here to say that just because someone has books about murders and a search history full of serial killers, that alone does not make them a murderer, because if that was the case, I for one would currently be partway through a lifetime stretch at Her Majesty's pleasure, so it takes a lot more than that to become a murderer. The police seize James's phone too, and they find a picture of the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, on there, as well as a very revealing internet search history. James had been researching who the 5 most horrific serial killers are. He'd been researching the Moors murderers, the Ipswich killer Steve Wright, and Ted Bundy, who, along with Peter Sutcliffe, was James's, quote, favourite serial killer, which I hate, by the way. No serial killer should be anyone's favourite anything. James was also interested in cannibals like Jeffrey Dahmer and fantasised about working on a concentration camp. So as you can see, by the time he was 15 years old, James was a very warped individual, withdrawn from the world and focusing more and more on the most depraved people and acts of crime that he could find. Police also find newspaper cuttings of the 2 murders, which he'd cut out and saved as trophies, reminders of what he'd done, enjoying how he'd terrified the people of Colchester and how he'd evaded capture. James did confirm that the killings were both random attacks. There was no specific profiling involved as to who he chose to kill. And the reason that James said he hadn't attacked anyone after Naheed for almost a year was because he said the first 2 murders made finding another victim very difficult. People were too scared to go out, and so he had to wait until enough time had passed that people started to venture out more. When speaking about Naheed, James said, shockingly, that after the first murder, she simply shouldn't have been walking alone, because she knew there was a murderer in town. In terms of James's explanation as to why he did what he did, he tells police that he had no choice and that there were voices in his head instructing him to do these things. He tells police, "My voices were talking to me. You need to make a sacrifice or we're going to come and get you. You need to do it." He says, "Whilst I was doing that, my voices were laughing and laughing and laughing, louder and louder." He said he was possessed by a demonic rage during the attacks. When asked why he had targeted Naheed's eyes, he said that it was so that she could not see evil. To get a better picture of how James had gotten to this point, the police start to look at James's background, his family and how he grew up. But as we know, James came from a good family. His parents were decent people who lived within the law and worked hard for a living. Right up until 11 years old, James was a good boy, a likeable and pleasant kid. But then, as we know, several things happened in his life, the bullying and the death of his grandma, and these seemed to trigger this change in him. It was also discovered that James' father had been diagnosed with mental illness in the past, so due to that, James had the potential to experience mental illness due to his genetics. It's at this point that James is seen by 3 psychiatrists brought in by James's legal team, who immediately diagnose him with autism. They also diagnose that James has been suffering from psychotic episodes and that he was likely having these episodes during the killings. This would mean that James, therefore, was not sane during the killings, and this in turn gives James an opportunity. Due to these findings, James would be able to admit the killings but plead guilty to manslaughter rather than murder due to diminished responsibility, saying he was not sane at the time of the murders. And it's at this point that the prosecution get their own psychiatrist to assess James too, and they come up with very different results. Dr. Joseph completely disagrees with the results the other psychiatrists have submitted. Dr. Joseph says that James was actually making all of this up, and there were no voices in his head and no psychotic episodes. So with two sets of professionals at loggerheads as to the reason behind the killings, it comes time for the trial, and by this point James is 17 years old and he pleads guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. But the problem for James is that the prosecution are not accepting that this was manslaughter. They believe that not only was he sane during the killings, but that he also premeditated them. They say that there was none of this demonic rage or psychotic episodes when he was planning how he would kill his victims by reading up on serial killers. They say there was no demonic frenzy when he was calmly disposing of the murder weapons and his bloodied clothing. They note that each time he killed, including his third attempt when he was arrested, he was wearing gloves each time so as not to leave fingerprints. They say these actions were all rational, someone who thought their actions through and knew what they intended to do all along, which doesn't fit with sporadic psychotic episodes. The prosecution say that James made sure that all of the evidence was disposed of very well, ensuring that he could continue killing for as long as possible. He clearly had aspirations to be a serial killer. Of course, the defence argue that, firstly, an interest in serial killers doesn't make you a killer. They argue that he has a genetic predisposition to mental illness, and after experiencing several stresses in his life, what happened here was the perfect storm, all leading to psychotic episodes. But this is where the prosecution bring in some very interesting evidence in relation to Kenneth Erskine, otherwise known as the Stockwell Strangler. This man was a serial killer who was responsible for the killing of 7 people in the 1980s. Now, the reason James had been researching him was for one reason in particular. James accessed web pages that specifically discussed Kenneth Erskine's attempts to have his murder convictions reduced to manslaughter by reasons of diminished responsibility. Why? Because he was hearing voices. The prosecution argue that this clearly shows premeditation, that James had already looked into how he might play this if he was ever caught, that he would base his defence on a similar one to Erskine's, to say he hears voices to get a murder conviction reduced to manslaughter. The prosecution then bring in Dr. Joseph into court, the one who believes James is lying, and he explains how he's come to this conclusion to the jury. And at the same time they play to the jury the videos of James admitting his crimes, those very detailed, calm descriptions of everything he'd done. Dr. Joseph says there's absolutely no chance that this child could have been experiencing these kind of psychotic episodes with no one noticing. He suggests that instead of hearing voices, it's more likely James was just acknowledging his own inner thoughts. He says James's stories about hearing voices are unconvincing and cliched. Dr. Joseph says James killed people because he was acting out his violent fantasies. He did it because he wanted to, and that is a rational thought process, not insanity. And of course, the defence then argue that 3 professionals have diagnosed him with psychosis. They say he was a 15-year-old child at the time. How could he possibly have the foresight and intelligence to fool 3 professionals? But the prosecution come back with more. They note how James originally was very detailed in his confession, and then not long after was claiming to have no memory of them at all. And then when he found out that the police had some physical evidence on him from the second murder, he was back to saying, oh well, yes, it was me, but the voices made me do it. The DNA that linked James to the scene of Naheed's killing only came out later when new DNA techniques were introduced, and it was then that James changed his story back again. The prosecution claimed that him changing his story for a 3rd time was him realising that now that they had physical evidence, he could be going down for murder. So he started with the hearing voices story again in hopes of getting his manslaughter plea through the courts. But the defence argue, well, this was a traumatic event. It's normal for your brain to section traumatic events away as a coping mechanism, and this is what James was doing. He was only a child after all. And after a 2-week trial, it's time for the jury to go away and make a decision on this young man. And on the 22nd of April 2016, after deliberating for 8 hours and 33 minutes, the jury return a unanimous verdict. James Fairweather is found guilty of murder. The jury do not accept James's plea of diminished responsibility, nor that voices had compelled him to kill. When it comes to sentencing, the judge gives some of his own opinions on this case. He talks about those superficial knife-tip wounds I mentioned earlier and how they had an element of control to them, as if James was doing it on purpose. He knew those small wounds wouldn't kill someone, they'd just hurt a lot, and he liked the idea of that. And that does not fit in with the idea that he was experiencing a psychotic episode. The judge says, "I have no doubt you relished the sense of power and control it gave you." The judge also points out that when James carried out the knife-point robbery at his local shop in 2014, he never mentioned any voices to those who were assessing him then. He made no reference to anything like that, and this was months before he committed his first murder. The first time anyone heard about these voices was when James was arrested for the murder of James and Naheed. The judge also notes that whilst James didn't select his victims in advance, he certainly went out looking for someone to kill. He had a knife with him and he was wearing gloves, knowing that if his fingerprints were found, he'd be identified immediately because his prints were on the police database. The judge says to James, "You knew exactly what you were intending to do and you achieved it." The judge also notes just how callously James had said that Naheed shouldn't have been out alone knowing there was a murderer in town. And after he's finished giving his thoughts on the 29th of April 2016, Judge Spencer sentences James Fairweather to a minimum of 27 years in prison, to which James has absolutely no reaction. Throughout the whole trial, James appears as though he has no sense of what he's done. He shows no remorse and even smiles at his parents playing around with his glasses in a joking manner. His mother attended trial every day and was often seen visibly upset. And James is sent down for a minimum of 27 years. In September 2016, James and his legal team tried to appeal against his sentence, saying that 27 years is excessive, that his young age was not taken into account, neither were his mental health problems. But the appeal judges agreed that they were all taken into account, and that this was a very serious case, and that the 27-year minimum sentence will stand. After the trial, questions were asked of the police and of Essex County Council in relation to James. People believed that after the robbery, James should have been watched more closely, but a spokesperson for the council came back and said a referral order does not warrant constant supervision. A review of the case has since been carried out and did not identify any issues or actions which could have prevented these tragic events. And questions were also posed to Essex Police when it emerged that James was one of the 70 people from across the North Essex area that was brought in for questioning due to knife-related offences. James gave an alibi of being home alone and was allowed to leave the same day and was never questioned further. The police replied that this was such a large-scale inquiry that they saw no reason to go any further with James. He didn't display any behaviour that concerned them during his questioning. James was never really a suspect, so if it wasn't for Michelle Sadler, it's impossible to know if and when James Fairweather would have been caught. And as for James Atfield's family, his sister Jo and mother Julie said James Fairweather is a monster for what he did. But they say they remember their Jim every day. They think of the good times they spent together and they say he'll never really leave them. Naheed's family said that life has become meaningless for them. They really struggled with Naheed's passing and for her to be taken away in such a cruel manner. Naheed's body was flown back to her home country and a funeral was held 4 days after her death and thousands of people attended. Essex University said Naheed was a bright, talented and conscientious member of our university community. We will continue to honour her memory through the Almaner Scholarship for Science, which is offered to overseas students studying science or health-related subjects at a postgraduate level. I think that was a lovely thing for the university to do, and it means that her memory lives on both in her home country and in the country she chose to live and study in before her tragic death. This was an incredibly sad case to cover. 2 innocent people lost their lives in such a brutal way at the hands of a 15-year-old boy. It really is tragic and a huge loss to both victims' families, and not only that, but it raises questions as to how a 15-year-old boy from a good home could spiral so quickly to become a killer so young. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on that one, so do let me know what you think. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave me a like, comment and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I've got a lot more videos planned and I'd love for you to stick around to see them. My Twitter handle is also below if you want to follow me over on there too. Have a great day, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.